Let's talk about this first big story, because this is really, really fascinating. We've got from Timcast.com over 900 pages of coronavirus research info at Chinese lab released following a FOIA lawsuit. Documents regarding the work of the Wuhan Institute of Virology are now public. The 900 pages of documents were obtained by the Intercept through ongoing Freedom of Information Act litigation against the National Institutes of Health. The collection includes specific information regarding EcoHealth Alliance, a U.S.-based health organization, and its use of federal funding to research bat coronaviruses. The outlet also received 2 grant proposals funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Gary Ruskin, executive director of the U.S. Right to Know, said this is a roadmap to the high-risk research that could have led to the current pandemic. But instead of taking it from Timcast.com, and with all due respect, this is information coming from the Intercept, who did the work on this one, my respect, we have this statement from Richard H. Ebright, verified on Twitter, so you know he's legit. Board of Governors, professor of chemistry and chemical biology at Rutgers.
Nice.
He cites the articles and then some quotes from the article, and then says, the materials show that the 2014 and 2019 NIH grants to EcoHealth with subcontracts to the Wuhan Institute of Virology funded gain-of-function research as defined in federal policies in effect in 2014 and 2017, and potential pandemic pathogen enhancement as defined in federal policies in effect in 2017 to present. He says this has been evident previously from published research papers that credited the 2014 grant and from the publicly available summary of the 2019 grant, but this now can be stated definitively from progress reports of the 2014 grant and full proposals of the 2017 grant. And he ends by saying this, because we don't got to read through everything, but it is particularly damning. The documents make it clear that assertions by the NIH director, Francis Collins, and the NIAID director, Anthony Fauci, that the NIH did not support gain-of-function research or potential pandemic pathogen enhancement at the Wuhan Institute of Virology are untruthful. To put it very simply, he is saying Fauci lied, Francis Collins lied, and now I think most of us realized this, but now we have the documents. What I think is particularly fascinating is the Intercept, of all places, that published this. And so, for what it's worth, we'll kick it off with something I saw from Glenn Greenwald. He said if he was going to make a bet, it was that they were trying to actually defend Fauci, and they may have accidentally just proven he lied. I don't know what your thoughts on this matter, Zed.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate about why they did it, because I wasn't in touch with any of these reporters. I still know some people over there, but I wasn't in touch with any of the reporters who did this story. I do think, though, that if that's what they were trying to do, it speaks well to them that they would publish anyway. I think we need more of that in journalism, is that you have a certain worldview or you have a certain hypothesis about the world. You go out there, you look for evidence, and maybe what you find disproves that, but you publish it anyway. I mean, that's what they do in science. It's what scientists are supposed to do. It's what the peer review process and the journal process is all about. And so I think if that is what Glenn is saying is true, it would actually speak well of the Intercept that they decided to publish something that goes against their worldview, which unfortunately I think is something that you see less and less of in a lot of these outlets these days.
You mean like real journalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally, journalism is about, journalism comes from the word journaling, meaning that you're describing or you're narrating the world as it is in front of you. You don't really do that when you start leaving out facts, when you start skewing things towards a particular perspective. There is a place for that. It's called advocacy, right? It's called activism. Right. It's what politicians do. It's what people who are lobbyists do, or people in the nonprofit world often do. And that's fine. And it's even, I would even argue it's fine to have journalists who have that particular perspective and who are going to go at it from that point of view. But it becomes a real problem when so much of the journalistic world has converted itself into activism, because you're not getting people who are just calling balls and strikes. And you're not getting people who are willing, who have the resources and the prestige and credibility to go out and find the facts, who will actually be able to report them even if they go against those preconceived notions or worldviews.
It's kind of a damning, it's kind of a condemnation of activism. The idea that activists who are supposedly fighting for something good are lying to you. I mean, that's just reality, right? Maybe propaganda is a better word for it. I'd like to imagine that as an activist, if you come across information that disproves what you're trying to push, you'd be like, oh, I was wrong about that. I once did fundraising for an environmental nonprofit. They gave us information on Deepwater Horizon. They sent us out to the streets to go ask people for money because they're like, we want to raise awareness, like literally on the ground telling people there's an oil spill. And then I was reading what they had given us in terms of, their script and everything. And then some guy stopped me and said, you're lying. That's not what happened. Here's the news. Here's what happened. And I was like, for real? Like, when I called my bosses and said, hey, this is not true, they said, oh, just keep reading it anyway. You're fine. And I was like, what? if we're not out here to tell the truth, to tell people there's a problem and we're misinforming them, why would I do this? And so I was like, nah, sorry, I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you have activists, you have advocates, yeah, generally speaking, it would be frowned upon just be outright making things up or lying. But I do think they tend to, just by the nature of their job, they tend to skew the truth, or they tend to arrange facts in a certain way. I mean, I wouldn't expect like the NRA to start saying, okay, well, here's all the flaws with having liberal gun policy, or like letting everybody own a gun. And I wouldn't expect the Brady control to be saying, here's 10 reasons why you might want to own a gun for self-defense, right? Like, we all anticipate that. But what happens when you start saying like CNN or the Associated Press taking more strident ideological or partisan positions, and they start being the ones who won't be telling you both sides of the story? I think that is when it really gets dangerous for a democracy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and let's throw it back to these fact checks on this reporting. When Rand Paul was clashing with Dr. Fauci, the craziest thing to me is that Rand is literally like, here's a study. It says something like rich gene pool, bat coronavirus or whatever. And he's like, it says in the study that you were making chimeric viruses, you were increasing infectivity, and this was funded by you. It says NIH. And then Fauci's like, no, that wasn't gain of function. And the way I describe it is like, imagine if a guy was on trial for theft. And he says, Your Honor, I didn't steal that piggy bank from that man's house. I simply walked into his house without permission, took the piggy bank and walked out with it. That's not theft. Like, you literally just defined theft, right? But what do we end up seeing? A bunch of fact-checking outlets misrepresenting what Rand Paul said. Many left or liberal establishment outlets started saying Fauci owns Rand Paul. And they were highlighting a lot of things like Fauci saying, you have no idea what you're talking about, instead of actually the merit of this research study. The craziest thing was how Reddit, which is like just bots, basically. Reddit is a bunch of bots who just pump stories to push propaganda. And there were still people breaking through being like, I'm confused why we're mad at Rand Paul here. He's right. The study says, that this happened. So this is what's crazy to me. It's good the Intercept published this. It's like you said, it actually reflects well upon them if they were actually doing this to prove Rand Paul wrong. They decided to publish anyway. BuzzFeed's done similar things where they publish good stories. But what happened? What do we say about all these outlets that dismiss the story as fake news, as they've been doing with basically everything, like Hunter Biden's son? Like, what does that say about journalism today?
Yeah, and I think this is like a big theme of a lot of our recent posts at inquiremore.com, which is a Substack that we hold. That we run, which is that I think that a lot of journalists now, they're having to choose between two missions. One mission is basically the traditional journalism, going out, discovering things about the world, describing it as the facts as they see them. The other one is to promote a certain worldview, to promote a certain set of values, right? And so I think that if something like a virus has become politicized, which it has been in the United States, there's actually like a red position and a blue position, a Democratic position and a Republican position, and everything COVID related now, unfortunately. More so here in this country than anywhere else in the world, I'd say also, which is an unfortunate aspect of it. Now that you have journalists who have kind of adopted this sort of post-journalism mindset, which is basically an advocacy or an activist mindset, I think they see their goal and their role as basically debunking or disproving whatever this quote-unquote Republican position on coronavirus is. We saw this earlier in the pandemic when they were all making fun of the idea that a lab leak may have been responsible for the pandemic. Now, we don't know where coronavirus or COVID-19 came from. Strictly speaking, we don't know. We don't have the evidence for it. But they were so quick to dismiss this theory. And now, even the Biden administration is keeping an open mind about it. Even they have not reached a firm conclusion on whether or not that's true, with the might of, more than a dozen intelligence agencies looking at it. So I think that when you have journalists adopt hard positions rather than keeping an open mind, rather than being curious and actually working to discover the world and report out the facts, you do get things like a Rand Paul being mocked and made fun of because they made up their minds before that hearing ever happened, that they were going to take Fauci's side, they were going to be against Rand Paul, they were going to poke holes in Rand Paul's argument, they weren't going to do it in Fauci's arguments. And that prevents them from actually being able to do what was done in this case with the hundreds of pages of documents that were obtained through the FOIA by the Intercept, is to actually go and look at the facts and see what happened. Literally see what happened and tell people what happened, and don't have an opinion about it. Don't tell people how they should feel, but literally give them the information that any reasonable person would need to know how to think about this problem, or how to think about the actual origins of this virus.
There is still a challenge with this report, and that's who was chosen by the outlet as an expert. And so this we're sitting here being like, wow, this professor at Rutgers has said these things that are untruthful. And of course, there's confirmation bias there. There have been several instances where we have seen experts chosen because their expert opinion might fit a specific narrative. Now, this one's interesting because the Intercept had no reason to choose a professor who would actually say, Fauci lied. So, in fact, I have reason to believe this is likely the case, likely true. If you see this all the time where they'll be like, a feminist professor agrees with us that feminism is good. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well, that's obvious, isn't it? Or, this critical race theorist proponent is considered an expert on this release of documents, and they're going to say something positive. But when you see a left or right wing outlet actually saying, hey, the other side's actually right on this one, or here's evidence suggests, I'm like, that's probably when it's true. Like, it's so glaringly true, this story, that even the Intercept had to be like, yeah, Fauci lied. I mean, they don't. But here's the best part. The Intercept doesn't mention Fauci. They don't mention he lied. They just say, hey, here's some information. And then when you read it, you're like, wait a minute. Sounds like Fauci lied. Is the guy going to get arrested, charged? Probably not. Because I guess we don't have accountability in this country. But I will say, you when you're talking about journalism, I don't know what happened, but maybe journalists didn't do enough to inspire the true tenets of journalism in the younger generation, or the activists got into colleges and turned J School into activism indoctrination camp or something.
Look, I think part of this wasn't, I was working at Think Progress, which was like a left-leaning blog in 2009, which is part of a left-leaning think tank. And I think a big part of it was that we had a frustration always that we felt like the news would be reporting two sides. Side A says something, side B says something. I know side B totally lied, but the news didn't really call them on it. The news just kind of weighed them equally. And, they call that false equivalence and so on and so forth. And there were times, I think, when news outlets were doing that and they were getting stories very wrong just because they weren't actually investigating what was true, because they were trying to provide balance to the story. But I think they overcorrected for a lot of that by basically saying that we're basically now offering a justification for being openly biased, right? One side is clearly wrong. There's no point to go to them and get comment from them. There's no point to go and even investigate whether what they said is true. They're clearly wrong. Just as most of the press said that it was clearly wrong that there was a lab leak that resulted in COVID-19, which is a conclusion now that even the intelligence community says is actually possible. They don't have a firm conviction on it. So I think that one, there was an overcorrection, and two, I think that it's just a reality that a lot of the younger generation tends to be left-leaning. And I think that those are the sorts of people that tend to go into these industries or these fields. If you go to your average publication, even if it's something very mainstream like ABC News or CNN, I will tell you like 9 out of 10 people who work there vote for Democrats, or they're left-leaning or they're liberals. And I think that just having that level of cloistered communities of people makes it much easier to just become very biased and not have anyone call you on it, not have anyone push back, and not have anyone at least provide a dissenting opinion. Even if I would say 60% of journalists were left-leaning or liberals, it'd probably still be okay because you'd still have enough conservative-leaning people around or people who have an open mind towards that point of view to say, hey, you need to consider X, Y, or Z, or we need to go and interview one additional person here to provide that alternative point of view. But I think when it's so overwhelming in a lot of these institutions and institutions that feed journalism, for instance, I wrote a report actually for The Intercept a few years ago about how the majority of editors and reporters at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both came from a small sliver of elite colleges. And we're talking about, I don't know how many colleges it was, but it was probably under 30 or something. They come from a very tiny slice, a tiny educational and cultural segment of the United States. And I think when you're so cloistered, when you're so segregated from the rest of the country, it becomes much easier to develop groupthink. It becomes much easier to avoid any kind of dissenting opinion, or at least one person in the room is going to stand up and say, hey, we need to consider this other side of this, and we need to report the other side of it, because otherwise we're not telling the whole story. Because I think a lot of these journalists honestly do think they're telling the entire story. They think what they're saying is completely uncontroversial, and you have to be kind of nuts to disagree. That's honestly what they think. I don't think it's a conspiracy. It's just like a confluence of these kind of influences and these kind of cultures.
I don't know. I think a lot of them have gone off. I think a lot of them are evil. Right. And I'll break that down because evil's not a light word to throw around. I mean, they actively understand they're omitting information. Like the Daily Beast, for instance. The Daily Beast is just notorious. There's no way some of these articles that come out, you're going to tell me this guy believes he's telling the truth. Because some of these things that are said are so absurd on their face. You're like, how is that even? No, but they'll write it and they'll publish it because their lawyers tell them yeah, you'll be safe on that one. When you see these publications putting out things that are just so over the top, you're like, how could that possibly be true? But they don't care. They don't, I don't think they think they're telling the truth.
Well, I think that there's probably two things happening simultaneously. One, I think a lot of these news outlets have shifted to basically subscriber kind of, this is a subscriber business model because the advertising business model was being basically dominated by a few digital firms like Google and Facebook. And so they wanted subscribers. New York Times shifted heavily towards subscribers after Trump was elected. So one, they have a financial incentive to cater to a certain worldview and a certain type of person. That person is not going to complain that much if they get stories wrong, as long as those stories have the right sort of oh, you smeared a Republican? Who cares? The Republicans are all evil anyway. They probably deserve it. They had it coming, right? So that's happening. And at the same time, they're hiring up people who legitimately believe a lot of these things, right? Yep. Who really deeply, firmly believe that even if their story isn't 100% fair, it overall is going in the right direction. So I'll give you an example. Ivormectin, which is this drug. Some people are using it for COVID-19. It's being called a horse dewormer or a horse drug in a lot of major press and major mainstream media. I criticize this. And there were journalists who were very defensive and saying, okay, maybe it's not exactly right that it's just a horse drug. Okay, maybe it's used for humans sometimes and it's prescribed for parasitic diseases. But the other side is just taking, the other side is just crazy. They're all conspiracy nuts. So they see themselves as part of an ideological battle. And as long as they're on the right side of that, even if they're not being 100% fair, honest journalists, they still see themselves as morally justified. I think that's why they don't see themselves as evil,
it's activism. Right? So here's where I fall with the whole ivermectin thing. There's conflicting studies. Data is inconclusive. FDA has not authorized or approved its use pertaining to COVID. But the World Health Organization says that it's an essential medicine, that it's used for treating river blindness, that it's basically eradicating this one parasite. And there are people who are doing, I think people who are eating horse paste are absolutely wrong to do it. And you know what? We know they're doing it because we had Dr. Chris Martenson come on this show and say that people were going to Tractor Supply and doing it. I'm like, you shouldn't do that. There's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't do that. But to then go out and say, Joe Rogan announced he's taking a horse dewormer. It's like, no, he didn't. Because there's Tractor Supply's horse dewormer, and then there's going to Walgreens to pick up your prescription your doctor told you to get. Now it's getting so over the top that there's apparently reports that certain pharmacies won't even fill prescriptions. Like, yo, pharmacist, you don't know what the prescription's for. If a doctor prescribes it, just say, okay, you're not the doctor. But that's the problem of hyperpolarization that we're seeing. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.